Good morning. It's nice to be here with all of you. And in particular, because this seems to be a diverse set of actors, right? Which is typically not what I see when I talk about social impact bonds or whatever. You know, usually we're kind of like lemmings. We kind of like stick with our own kind, and it seems that's not the case here. So thanks for a few minutes of your time. I want to start by saying or admitting that I spent a lot of my working life talking about quality, affordable housing, the social determinants of health, the impacts of childhood poverty. But despite the fact that I started my career at a homeless shelter, I don't come into contact with poverty nearly as often as I talk about it. But most recently, through our church, my family has come to know two children who are being raised by their handicapped grandparents after being abused by their mother and her partners while their father is in jail for manslaughter. And these kids have, as you can imagine, a range of physical, social, safety needs, and it's really hard to see how their lives could be markedly different without substantial and smart investment. I bring up McCain and Enzi because they're close to my heart, but the consequences of having social service spending in this country continue to erode are really real for them. Aiden isn't going to Head Start because they were late registering and there were no slots. Their food stamp budget was just cut, as many people's was. Mackenzie, who had all of her teeth extracted, forgive me if I wander, just wave, doesn't see a dentist regularly for follow-up because they can't get to a provider. And I mention this because I want to ground this conversation in cold facts. There's an urgency to this work. It's not academic. How hard we work, how creatively we work, how cross-sector we work has real implications for people on the ground, and they're counting on you and they're counting on me to do this well. So let's keep that at the forefront of our minds. So we're here because despite the fact that over the last 40 years, spending on social services has grown magnificently, it has failed to really improve the economic and social well-being for an astonishing large segment of Americans. Census Bureau data shows that over the last 40 years, the yearly average income of the bottom 40% of Americans, now $20,221, has changed little after inflation. Data from the Department of Education about the end result of what we provide in our K-12 educational system has failed to improve the results in that system as well, despite a 90% increase in public spending per student adjusted for inflation. And although we've done a great job in this country generating wealth, we've done a lousy job in distributing that wealth. And so more and more people are struggling. You probably saw there was an article in the New York Times recently that poverty is now increasingly mainstream. 4 out of 5 Americans during their lifetime will experience at least a year of poverty. Half of all American children will find themselves during their lifetimes growing up in a household that relies on food stamps. And at the same time that the situation is eroding for individuals, the government at all levels is struggling and likely to struggle even greater in the future. State and local deficits, not only as a result of the financial crisis, but also because of long-term structural gaps of spending and revenue, that continues to be a situation that is going to grow worse in the future. If you look at public pensions and the funding of public pensions potentially as a canary in the coal mine, that's an early warning system of future fiscal trouble. 9 states have saved less than 60% of what they need for their retirees. Illinois has only saved 43 cents of what they need for their public pensioners. And with spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security projected to rise by 3% of GDP this decade, spending for everything else will be really scarce. So the lack of having a dollar today means that we're spending a multiple of that dollar in the future trying to fix problems that we might have been able to cure for today. But a recent article noted, and I love this, that government has not had the luxury of taking the future into consideration. Isn't that a sad commentary? But just when the situation seems really dire, along comes a new great idea. Provides a new source of capital, rewards programs that work, and provides a return for investors. And so we have social impact bonds. So as you know, social impact bonds were implemented in the UK in 2010, where the first transaction sought to reduce recidivism among short-term nonviolent offenders in the Peterborough prison, 60% of whom were likely to reoffend after the first year. Using a control group, as if for comparison, the Ministry of Justice signed a contract that agreed to repay investors if recidivism was lowered by 7.5%, and they would agree to pay an additional bonus to those investors if recidivism fell even further than 7.5%. It seems like a good deal. And it came across the United States like wildfire. I remember being in a meeting in New York several years ago where all these, financial geeks were talking about all the transactions we would do, on the framework of this new structure. But at Kresge, we are increasingly trying to let the tool follow the problem. And for example, we're trying to pivot from the bifurcation of grants and other investments to looking at each funding request agnostic of the response that we might provide, and really looking first, is it strategically aligned, and then what is the source of capital that we might provide for it. And I believe that we can follow a similar line of thinking when we think about SIBs. What's the problem that we're trying to solve with this and other related tools? And I think there's 4. We want to address the capital shortfalls in fund prevention. We want to bring transparency to what works. We want to modify future public funding behavior, and we want to make meaningful gains in human suffering. But these objectives aren't unique to SIBs. I'd say that there are requirements to move the social sector to a higher level of efficacy. So there's only 4 little letters that separate these words, but these are vastly different things. The federal government devotes approximately 1/6 of its spending on 10 major means-tested programs to provide cash or cash assistance to people with low and few assets. Total spending on those 10 programs, adjusted to exclude inflation, rose tenfold since 1972, when only half of the programs even existed. In total, the federal government spent $588 billion on these 10 programs, exclusive of state matching requirements. Many of these programs, Head Start, Title I, are administered in block grants, awarded non-competitively with few measurable outcomes beyond people served and services delivered. The federal government and the states are in the business of procuring services. Value derived for those services, both from a cost and an outcome standpoint, is elusive. And that's why SIBS has been such a powerful accelerant for talking about what can we do to derive value. So there's a mastermind about somebody that procured value, and it's Brad Pitt. No, not really Brad Pitt, but who saw Moneyball? All right. One of my favorites. So Brad Pitt played Oakland A's general manager Billy Beane in the film, which is a terrific true tale about how to use data. Beane built a winning team with significantly fewer dollars than his competitors. His young assistant helps Beane to shift from a mindset of buying players to buying wins. And using data, Beane and his assistant, Paul Podesta, uncovered talented players that they were overlooked by other teams, and they were able to acquire them for vastly less expense. In short, they got more money, more results for less money, and revolutionized baseball. And I would say that pay for performance in the social sector, that social sector which relies on data and seeks hidden value, is our version of Moneyball. So thanks to the great work that's been undertaken by the Rockefeller Foundation, the SIB Lab at Harvard, and others, 9 states, as Caroline mentioned, are procuring or looking for at SIB transactions. But I would say that at Kresge, we believe that SIBs are actually part of a larger family of something we call social impact transactions, SITs, things that help all sectors to identify what is working and how to pay for it with less funds. We're at an inflection point when the interests of the public sector, providers, and philanthropy are fully aligned to find new ways to do business, and SIBs have ignited that conversation about moving from outputs to outcomes. But just as SIBs are not a bond, they're also likely not the only solution. And if we allow the marketplace to stop innovating and imagining at SIBs, there's a danger that we're going to leave undiscovered structures which are simpler, easier to replicate, and with a lower degree of difficulty. Can you imagine if we had stopped here? Can you believe it? This poor man, how embarrassing. So with so many eyes focused on a new way of doing business, this is the moment for rapid innovation. We need to fast-track multiple structures, and Kresge has set out to participate and help develop a catalog of SITs to learn both programmatically and financially what works and what doesn't. Some of our SITs do include success payments from the public sector, but others are simpler structures. Take, for example, a $3 million loan that we recently made to the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. CCH is a provider of housing and health services to very vulnerable at-risk families in Metro Denver, and they wanted to expand those health services before Medicaid expansion was fully implemented. We wanted to drive them further to get more outcomes from their services and for their families. So what we did is we made them a loan that was based on performance metrics and linked the interest rate that they pay on that loan to their achievement of outcomes on 10 fronts. If CCH fully meets the objectives, which do require them to exceed current levels of performance, the interest rate can go as low as 1%. We're also deep in development with national church residences in the state of Ohio. In 2012, we funded a study that looked at the economic benefit to the state when national church residences moved a frail or disabled individual from a high-cost skilled nursing care setting into affordable assisted living. And what that study found, was that the state was saving $73 a day or $26,000 a year per individual. Now, NCR only operates 150 units of affordable assisted living because the way that they create those units is through a HUD program called the Assisted Living Conversion Program. And those dollars are in ridiculously short supply, so they have been unable to build new units. But what we know is there's thousands of people in Ohio who could be happier, healthier, and more cheaply served if more units were available. So SIBs helped to spur a conversation with the state that contemplates taking a portion of the $73 a day that they are benefiting from when these individuals are able to be moved and using that as debt service on the construction of new affordable assisted living. Should this transaction close, and I need karma coming from the audience that it will, please, over the course of 11 years, the state will save over $15 million on 75 individuals after their $5.5 million savings contribution. Now, wouldn't you like to be the public official that discovers that? So along with third sector, we're also investing in a traditional SIB in Massachusetts, the Juvenile Justice Pay for Success transaction. And that transaction focuses on high-risk young men who are served through ROCA, a very high-capacity nonprofit service provider who has designed and perfected a clinical intervention model over 20 years. These men are likely to face a lifetime of poverty, repeated incarceration, were it not for a program that ROCA runs. Every year, 4,000 young men age out of the juvenile justice system in Massachusetts, and 65% of them will be reincarcerated within 5 years. ROCA's intervention drops that number to 22%. Along with Goldman Sachs, Living Cities, and Kresge, we're providing $1.5 million of subordinated debt in that transaction. The state of Massachusetts will provide $20 million in success payments to investors if ROCA achieves the results. But returns for investors are fully dependent on ROCA. But I'd like not to just limit ourselves to think that SITs are only applicable to human services. We have provided funding on the way to a transaction to use energy efficiency in a SIT structure. SAFE and enterprise community partners are working with HUD and with us to reduce the $7 billion that HUD spends on energy costs. Talk about a rich vein of saving opportunity. In development is a $30 million pay-for-performance transaction that will use private capital to make energy efficiency improvements in HUD housing so that HUD does not have to make an upfront investment. Again, we're missing that first dollar. Perversely, there are no incentives for operators of HUD housing to make energy efficiency measures, and so Safe and Enterprise have designed a transaction that will use an ESCO to execute the work. HUD shares in a portion of the savings it realizes alongside of the investors. So there's lots of good stuff here, but I'd say that there's opportunities and obstacles. And an at-scale pay-for-performance sector could potentially significantly disrupt the social service procurement process. But as in any emerging field, there exists a disconnect between concept and execution, and we shouldn't gloss over what the issues are. In my opinion, there's three primary benefits to pay-for-performance. Inform government about what's working so that it can prioritize funding to value-creating interventions. And for me, this is the big, hairy, audacious goal that I think that we need to keep front and center. Conceivably, we could not need SIB, SITs, or anything else if there was a feedback loop that informed the government about how to make future funding decisions based on what works. And let's not get geeked out about that, elusive opportunity for all those impact investors out there, because government spending on social services is always going to dwarf any kind of SIT market that we could develop. So let's focus on SITs as a tool that can change government funding behavior. Transparency of results. So there's value to having indicators that obviously tie measurement to economic success, and sometimes there's value to having a third party involved. For example, in the low-income housing tax credit market, before 1990, the affordable housing development cycle was fully government funded, but the advent of the credit created a marketplace for developers and investors to share economically in the long-term performance of a project. And as the credit has grown up, we've learned how to price that credit, taking into consideration developer capacity, project economics, expenses, risk to the investor. So LIHTC, I think, provides a useful corollary for this market that we should follow. Finance services and not just real estate. So for years, my daughter carried around this really disgusting blanket that nobody else would ever want to touch. And I mention it because real estate is the security blanket for investors today who want to make a difference in communities. It's understandable, quantifiable, liquidatable. And we can estimate over time how it will perform, and we know what will add or detract to its value. But on the frontier are transactions that rely not on a hard asset, but rather on the value that we create in human life and future productivity. Take, for example, all those kids in Roca. Not only is the system avoiding paying for jail time, but the benefit of a tax-paying consumer has a ripple effect for that person's lifetime and for the economy. So I know there's some providers in the room, so I want to mention some risks that come to my mind and are areas of concern for me. Protracted development times in these transactions and risk to the provider. So not surprisingly, these things are long in the making, and they can expose providers and intermediaries to what I call structural starvation. And as an example, we've been working with the CDFI for 2 years on an innovative financing program in New York City. Around the table was a large national bank, the city government, several social investors. The CDFI had hundreds of hours of staff time and legal costs wrapped up into this transaction. And when the finish line just in sight, the whole thing dissolved. Few organizations have the financial or organizational bandwidth to be able to live through those kind of protracted development cycles, and I think investors have a responsibility to be mindful of what we're asking people to do and how long that they're being asked to do it. We need to address the wrong pocket syndrome and the totality of benefit. I think a challenge to pay for performance is the size of the opportunity set, which may seem contradictory given the size of the social service sector. But I think that the number of straight line opportunities where the savings clearly accrue to one beneficiary are fairly limited. This may account for the preponderance of activity that we've seen around recidivism and incarceration. Transactions that are more likely to generate moderate savings to multiple payers, I think, is the larger opportunity set. but we'll need to figure out ways to roll up those savings to find pools and pools where the opportunity to monetize the savings is large enough, and this has implications for data, policy, and investors. And failure. Unless we're creaming the market, finding lowest hanging fruit, some of this is not going to work. And in a cycle of innovation and experimentation, that should be okay. In New York, we're seeing the first transaction being sold to high net worth but still retail investors. Early failures could spook the market just when it's learning what works. We're seeing similar strains in the crowdfunding space, another potentially powerful tool for harnessing capital, but lots of experiment and early failures. Smart philanthropy has an especially important role in taking in the development of this marketplace as idea generators, conveners, investors, risk takers, and partners in evaluation. But some of this is not going to work, and we need to be prepared for that. So for all you finance aficionados out there, who knows what DSCR stands for? Oh, come on. Debt service coverage ratio. Okay, so I'm going to rename debt service coverage ratio for the purposes of this discussion to data standardization, capacity, and rapid recalibration. These are 4 ingredients that I think we need for a sector to survive and thrive. Data. So many of us probably remember the phrase that was coined by James Carville during President Clinton's re-election campaign, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, my remake of that famous phrase is, "It's the data, damn it." Because the linchpin of all of this is high-quality, multi-year data. And data are probably our most powerful weapon for harnessing capital and changing policy is woefully underinvested in by the philanthropic and public sector. And I challenge all of us, if you're serious about pay for performance, then you've got to double down on data. The runway to good data is long, and if we aspire to an at-scale pay-for-performance sector, then we must lay the groundwork by heavily invested in data systems, collection, and analysis. Standardization. With the resources and risk tolerance of a large national philanthropy at my disposal, sometimes I think the transactions we create are kind of like one-eyed unicorns. They're beautiful, they're impactful, but they're unlikely to be replicated elsewhere. It's too early in this market to look for standardization, but I think that we need to keep in the back of our mind that creating templates, common frameworks, metrics, and guidelines for results and returns is going to be a necessary part of going to scale. Provider capacity. Watching ROCA through the Massachusetts transaction or National Church Residences through the Ohio transaction has underscored for me that not every provider is equipped to participate in pay for performance. In fact, I would say that most are not, or at least are not today. These structures require leadership confidence in the efficacy of their services based on performance data. They must be clear on their business interests and comfortable taking reputational and financial risks over long periods of time. Lily Elkins, one of the leaders of ROCA, noted in an article recently that pay for success marks the arrival of a higher standard for outcome measurement and financial accountability for nonprofits seeking public dollars. Ultimately, she goes on to say, the future of this approach rests on the provider's preparedness and performance. Rapid recalibration. So about 10 years ago, I was running the investment management group at a large tax credit syndicator. And my boss at that time was a gentleman named Bart Harvey. And one summer he went away and he became evangelical about green. Now at that time, I know it's hard to believe now, but at that time nobody was talking about green. And certainly no one was talking about green in affordable housing. But Bart unapologetically came back and said we were going to green affordable housing, and he told me to go find $50 million to do it. But over the next decade, green did get tightly knit into affordable housing. We learned about the benefits. We learned how to monetize the savings. We learned that greening the property had benefits for not just the health of the tenants, but for the economic health of the property and its investors. We wove it into policy, and we learned that we could also figure out how to weave it into getting tax credits awarded. And today, it's hard to get tax credits without some green elements being put into project design. I mention this because this process of greening affordable housing took about a decade. And the opportunity for us all in Pay for Performance is to figure out how to decrease that adoption time, that R&D time, I challenge us to half. Understanding that we need more money and we need better solutions on the ground today. And we can do that by forcing a culture of rapid experimentation. So let's push the market to the widest opportunity set possible. So in closing, I hope when you think about SITs, SIBs, Pay for Performance, you think of Billy Beane and the Oakland A's. Because Billy picking players is not all that dissimilar from the public or philanthropic sector picking providers, except that our stakes are much higher. So your homework this evening is to go home and rent Moneyball and imagine how we can be as successful in repositioning social services as Billy Beane was in repositioning the Oakland A's. SIBs, SITs, others give society a chance to capitalize on our values. Find what works, reward what works, invest in people, and create a capital market for good. So let's go do that. Thank you.